the Crossroads at Big Creek. And we do it in partnership with the Door County Library. They're the one that is handling all the Zoom. And we do this, like I say, our 7th year. Before I get into introducing the speaker tonight, I just want to make a point to the poster and say the next one in the regular series is coming up on February 27th. It'll be Scott Hansen talking about the status of Lake Whitefish and in Lake Michigan and Green Bay. On March 27th, we've invited someone from the Menominee tribe to come and talk to us about Menominee tribe fisheries and what they do there. As there's more and more interest in how the indigenous approach to fisheries and resource management, and hopefully we'll learn what they do on the reservation. And then in April, it's an update of the Codaware Tag Program. It'll be Matt Corners from the Green Bay office of the Fish and Wildlife Service. That program started off with lake trout and Chinooks, and in the last few years they've been focusing on steelhead. So a lot of that steelhead information hasn't gotten out. So I thought it was a good time to bring someone from the mass marketing program to update us on what they're learning about steelhead, and then also on Chinook salmon and lake trout. So stay tuned. And at the end of this program, a week from tonight, we have a really cool movie, and I'm going to show the trailer at the end. So we will go over that at the end. So this is actually, tonight our speaker is Dr. David Bunnel. It's actually his 2nd appearance at the Fish Tales Lecture Series. He first came here in 2020 when he was a fishery research biologist at the USGS Great Lakes Science Center. And he shared with us how changes in the Lake Michigan food web may be limiting Lake Michigan fisheries. 5 years later, he's still at the Great Lakes Science Center. He now serves as the Corrigan Science Program Director. And we're privileged to have Dr. Bunnel here tonight for his presentation. And I have to, should get rid of that, shouldn't I? I have to thank our sponsors, because if it wasn't for our sponsors, he wouldn't be here. He sent me an email around the first week of January and said, well, they didn't shut the government down, but they only gave us a continuing resolution, which to a federal agency, that means you can't overspend. You got to crunch way down, stay low, because you don't know what your budget's going to be for the rest of the year. And the guidance he got was, you can't travel. So that was kind of a panic. But we worked together with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and especially Healthy Water Door County, and we're able to get together the money that needed to pay for his travel. And it all happened so fast. Never happened that fast in government before. So I'm really pleased that he's here, but it is because of our good sponsors here. Healthy Water Door County actually helped sponsor our first year that we did this, and also has upgraded the AV system here. So they've been a strong supporter of Fishtails, and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, well, we're able to get them to pay for some of it too. So with that, I'm just going to turn over to Bo and let him tell us about opportunities for native prey restoration.
Hey, thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be back, and I'm glad I was able to be here. And this didn't do this when we tested earlier. Which mic? That one. Oh, no, that's off. Okay. Now, can you all hear me well enough? Speak up a little bit more. Okay. Right on. Yeah, it's on. Am I good? Okay. So again, I'm excited to be here, and what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of a story. We kind of look backwards and talk about some of the bad things that have happened and some of the diversity we've lost, but now we have an opportunity because of some of the improvements that we've made, that some of those fish that still are swimming around in other places, the Great Lakes, now may have a better chance to come back in places like Lake Michigan. So this is kind of the trajectory that we're going to be talking about. And many of this, some of this sort of history stuff maybe is you know the stories, or maybe some of it's new, or maybe I'll introduce some new species or some new sort of scientists. So let's just jump right into it. So I'm going to be talking about things from sort of a fish perspective. What has been beneficial to fish, but we're going to start with some of the things were not so helpful to fish. So settlers came in and we needed wood, of course, to sort of fuel our houses and all the things we do as we build. And we had almost complete deforestation. And the best thing to do is to float those logs down the rivers, down to, of course, the sawmills. Some amazing footage of, here's one here. This is like a world record log jam that happened in the Grand River. So in sort of southeast Lake Michigan. So what happened is sort of they're storing the logs, and then the flood came, and it was and then the logs escaped 7 miles long, 30-foot deep. And you can see some of the people in 1883 that were gathering along the bank there to see this once-in-a-lifetime event. So when we do this, of course, this leads to a lot of sediments that come into the water. Fish like to spawn in rocky habitat, gravelly habitat, and when that gets filled in by all the sediment that is now loose because there's no vegetation or trees to hold it, not a good place for like fish spawning. The other thing, of course, that affects temperature. When we lost all that cover, some of our cooler water habitat probably was affected up in these tributaries to the Great Lakes. Another really prominent example is over in the Detroit River, so closer to where I came from today from Ann Arbor. So if we zoom in on the Detroit River, the Livingston Channel, as it's known today. In 1907, the federal government passed the River and Harbor Act. And the point of it was to improve transportation for shipping. Which is, of course, a very necessary thing. But to do that, they had to blast through. This is the early part of the Army Corps of Engineers. This was essentially, they dewatered, they moved the Detroit River around so they could blast out this channel to increase the depth. But this is what the habitat looked like. This is ideal, perfect spawning habitat for many fishes. And by the time they were done blasting out this deep channel now to improve the shipping, that was a primary spawning habitat for one of the largest freshwater fishery in the Great Lakes, Cisco in Lake Erie. Well before there were walleye and yellow perch in Lake Erie, there were Cisco, and a massive amount of their spawning habitat was destroyed. You probably know about dams, more than 270,000 dams across the Great Lakes watershed. The important thing from a fish perspective is that blocks for many fish is all that habitat upstream that they used to be able to access, before the 19th century, 18th century, when we started building dams. Okay, so why am I talking about all this? Well, my job is to try, when the fishery managers invite us to do so, to restore or conserve the most native prey fishes of the Great Lakes. And the most diversity that we had in the Great Lakes were these things called ciscos. Ciscos with the small c. It's very confusing. How many people have heard of like the general term of the ciscos small c before? Not many, okay. How many people have heard of lake herring? Yeah, so lake herring, now the common name is cisco, like capital C. But generally, this group of 8 species is called little c ciscos. Hey, Scott. So very confusing, right? So look at what the case is as I'm going through these slides, like lowercase c. We're talking broadly about this diverse group of fish. And so these are like silver pointy-faced fishes. They kind of look like whitefish. Most of you probably know whitefish, but the difference is these are more pointy. They're sort of a terminal mouth fish. We had 8 species of these ciscos at one time in the Great Lakes before we started doing all this stuff to its habitat, and before we really started being able to fish in farther and farther more deep offshore waters. So they were what sort of propelled the lake trout. That was the major food for lake trout, was this diversity of ciscos. And some got to be really large, some stayed pretty small when it was an intact community. And so culturally very important to tribes and First Nations. And again, this Arteti, Gorgonus arteti here, this is the lake herring or capital C Cisco. This is the one that supported this massive fishery in Lake Erie. So the other part of that Coregonine family are the whitefishes. So Cisco's plus whitefishes equals sort of the Coregonine family. And many of you, I think, probably are more familiar with the whitefishes, right? Probably lake whitefish is the most common, the most abundant. Now the sort of the largest commercial fishery in the Great Lakes, the upper Great Lakes at least. Lower diversity, only 3 species of whitefish. The lake whitefish that you know. There's also the round whitefish or Menominee, it's also called. And then Lake Superior has a pygmy whitefish. Doesn't get bigger than this. It's like a dwarf whitefish. But we don't see that pygmy whitefish anywhere else in the other Great Lakes. So what I'm going to be talking about today mostly is Cisco's, these guys, because these are more the prey fishes, the historical prey fishes that supported the trout and now might support the salmon, right? But I just wanted to sort of tell you that they're related, the same genus as the whitefishes. Okay, so the other part about the native prey fishes in the Great Lakes were the sculpins. So most of you probably know about gobies, but we have other native benthic fish. These are slimy sculpin, deepwater sculpin, spoonhead sculpin in Lake Superior, and we used to have it in Lake Michigan. I'm not going to be talking about the sculpins today. The sculpins generally seem to be doing okay out there in offshore waters, for the most part. It's the Cisco's that I'm going to talk to you about. And we know about the Cisco's because of this very interesting man, or the scientists know about him, I should say, Walter Kelts. So here he is on, I don't know where, on a camel or something. I'm not sure exactly. I'm not that kind of biologist, but Walter Kelts lived to be almost 100 years old. And for his PhD from the University of Michigan in 1920, he studied the diversity of these Cisco's, this diverse group, in the Great Lakes and in Lake Nipigon, which is like just upstream of Lake Superior. And then he decided he was done with fish, and he moved on to go to Africa and Europe and collect birds and plants and artifacts. And he became very famous for that. And a lot of his things are still in museums across the world. But for Coregonine lovers like myself, his dissertation, which was ultimately published in 1929, it's like this thick, is our Bible, because it describes what the diversity was before all of it was lost. And when he was studying it in 1929, it was on its way to, like, we were losing some of it, but it's the most sort of intact description of what occurred in the early 20th century that we have. Okay, and so this is what he described. Again, here are these silver pointy-faced fishes. I call them like Darwin's finches of the Great Lakes. So they essentially radiated into different depths. Some of them went up into the rivers, others went into the embayments, others went into the deepest waters, hundreds of meters of water. And they sort of made their own unique niches throughout these different habitats. Just like those finches that evolved to feed on different seed types, you know, down in the Galapagos Islands regions described by Darwin. And so this is what we had. And we had a ton of it in Lake Michigan. Look at that. We had all 8 species there. Lake Huron had even more because they had a lot of diversity of the lake herring. 3 different types of lake herring that were described. As you went lower down, you didn't have as much deep water. We didn't have as much diversity, like the habitat complexity for these species to really evolve into. Okay, so this is what we had in the early 1900s described by Walter Kelts. And I don't expect you to be able to see all this, but the idea is the way that we can tell these silver pointy-faced fishes apart based on sort of their head shape, their eye size, and then their gill rakers. So fish have the gill rakers that help them sort of filter out what's in the water column. And these have as few as 29 gill rakers to as many as 47 gill rakers. So again, different specializations. You lose me there. Different specializations. They occupy different depths. They spawn at different times. Most of them fall, winter, spring. tough time to study when they're spawning. And I should have put those in inches, but they can be 10 inches, anywhere between 6 inches and 12 or 14 inches in size. So this is that diversity that we had. All right, so now we're going to go back to like some of the things that caused us to lose that diversity. This is a sort of an iconic picture. This is at the very tail end of that massive commercial fishery in Lake Erie. This is a boat that had come out of Sandusky, went to near the Detroit River, and brought so many fish, Cisco back, nearly sunk the ship. And they got this amazing photo, but a lot of fishing helped sort of drive down these populations. And so it was at this time in 1930 that the lab where I am today went on its first sort of scientific mission. They built this boat called the Research Vessel Fulmar, made out of wood. And they went out, and their idea was to let's fish with gill nets between 2 and 3/8 inch, all the way up to 3-inch mesh. And let's see how many different fish species we're going to catch with this smaller mesh than what the typical fisher would have used. And let's see if we can maybe inform some regulation so we don't overfish this diversity that we have. So they went out, here they are setting that experimental gill net off of this gill net-like tug. I love this US government experiment for the buoy flag. I mean, there's a lot going on in this picture. First of all, I don't dress when I go out as a scientist with a tie and a nice hat like that. We don't have chefs, but if we do, I'm not sure I'd want that chef like cooking for me. And then this has got to be staged, right? I mean, really, I can't imagine this is how they were, but when you see how they wrote, well, here's a better picture that I can relate to. So here they are working up the fish. They've got lake trout, Cisco there, scales all over, the workup area. But this gives you a sense of the coverage that these guys did between 1930 and 1932. 300 gill net sets. They would start in February, end in November. A lot of effort in Green Bay there. Most of the deep water Cisco data I'm going to show you is from the main lake. So here's an example of some of the records we still have in our lab. And this is the penmanship that these guys would write with. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's talking about the standard length of the fish, the total length of the fish, the weight, the sex. Incredible, I think it's over 4,000 individual records by species. Incredible effort, dwarfs anything we do today, I'm afraid to say. So this one's out of our scene. All right, so just to boil that down, going back to the diversity, the most abundant fish they caught was Coregonus hoyi, which some of you may know today, that's the bloater. So historically, bloater was the smallest of all of those fishes, of all of those small sea Ciscos. The largest was Nigripinus, or the blackfin. Large size, really dark, pigmented. Deep water Cisco, the Yohani, was also very large. And most of what was left by 1930 to 32 was the smallest ones. And this is something we see pretty common in fisheries. It's called like fishing down, the food chain when overfishing is a problem. So 1930 to 32. Now, some of you mentioned that you knew about lake herring. So the heart of lake herring, or Cisco, which as it's now called, was in Green Bay. There was a massive Cisco fishery in Green Bay. This is some model data that we did a couple of years ago using that Fulmar data set, which isn't perfect because Cisco are not really, this species of Cisco is more up in the water column, but the highest catches were in the embayments, but they occurred all throughout the lake. All right, so here we are in the 1930s now. We've just described this diversity through Walter Keltz's manuscript and through these scientists going out and undertaking the largest survey that's ever been done in Lake Michigan. And here come the sea lamprey. Everybody knows sea lamprey, probably. I don't need to talk about sea lamprey. But the key thing is sea lamprey got to Lake Michigan by 1936. And you can see their teeth, they're not really teeth, but they latch on to fish. I had a cool video, but it wasn't working very well. but they essentially attack the largest, as adults, they attack the largest fish they can find. And at that time in the 1930s in Lake Michigan, that was lake trout, but also some of these large ciscos they would go after. And so here's the time series for lake trout in Lake Michigan in terms of harvest. So sea lamprey come in 1936, about where that red arrow is. And within 10 years, those lake trout are gone, collapsed. Pretty steep drop off. And you can see that through stocking and some changes in the lake, I don't have this out to recent years, it would build up even more. But lake trout are coming back, but not harvested in the same ballpark as what they used to be. So here's our second sort of interesting scientist. So Stan Smith, born about 30 years after Walter Kelts, just died about 10 years ago. Both of these guys are long lived. And so he got his PhD after the war in 1954. He studied cisco in Green Bay, and an amazing dissertation on that. And right after he graduated from University of Michigan, he joined the lab where I am now, which was at that time the Fish and Wildlife Service. And he decided, I'm going to go back and I'm going to sample those same sites where the Fulmar sampled in the 30s and see what's left of the diversity. So we did that in 54, 55, and then 60 and 61. The other interesting thing about Stan Smith is the Fish and Wildlife Office in Green Bay had a new boat built, and I think Mr. Holy here had a large role in getting that boat designed and built, christened in 2018, and it is for Lake Michigan research. And it's because of this man, Stan Smith, who again was one of the key players in describing this native prey fish diversity that once existed. All right, so what did Stan and his colleagues find? He published this in 1964. And now I'm just showing you how that community has changed and really become even more and more dominated by bloater, the smallest it was the most abundant then. It's by now much more dominant. And sadly, we no longer have Johanni and we don't have Nigripinus. So by 1954, 55, we don't have the two largest of those deep water species. And they're also not found in Lake Superior or Lake Huron. There's some question about whether we have Nigripinus, the same Nigripinus in Lake Superior today, but Johanni doesn't exist anywhere else. It is extinct. Nigripinus, for the Great Lakes Nigripinus, we're still trying to figure out, is it extinct or just extirpated from Michigan and Huron? But we had low levels of some of the other species. So these are called the short jaw cisco, the long jaw cisco, the short nose cisco, kai, we just call it kai, and that's still really abundant in Lake Superior, and that's bloater. So these are the species names. I'm just telling you the common names. All right, so here we are, like 1950. What else starts really ramping up after the war? We get, of course, a lot of industry that started even before the war, but really got going to support the war effort. Steel industry is what I'm showing you here in southern Lake Michigan around the Calumet River. A lot of point source pollution, just dumping from a pipe all the waste right into the river, right into the lake. It's kind of incredible, sort of the ethics and the mindset then, 100 years ago, and even more recently. The Cuyahoga River, many of you may have heard about. Here's some images of the river on fire. These would be essentially oil that would leak out through the production in Cleveland. Here are some officials putting in a white sheet, pulling it up, showing the grease and the oil. And, I'm kind of embarrassed to say I had never read Silent Spring until COVID. Everybody had more time in COVID to kind of do things like that. I picked it up, read it. It was pretty astonishing to kind of read what she described. And the Silent Spring is not about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. It's about springs without birds singing because of all of the pesticides that were out there. So we're beginning to have this environmental awakening, but we're not quite there yet in terms of policy. Here we are now, 1960 to 61. How are things going? Well, they're kind of trending in the same way that Stan had found in 1954 and 55. Just very small blips of those other species. Again, no evidence of Johanni or Nigrippinus. And if I were to show you this today, I don't have a slide for it, but it would only be one species. It would be hoyi. That's all we have. We don't have kii in Michigan or Rigardi or alpinae or Xenithicus. It's just hoyi. And it's been that way since the 1980s, more or less. All right, so here we are now, 1961. We're going to have a new friend come in. And so the same way that sea lamprey are able to come in, alewife were able to follow that same path. But alewife really were not successful at colonizing a lake until there was very limited predation pressure. So it was the collapse of lake trout due to sea lamprey, due to overfishing, that opened up this niche or this lack of predation. Again, very few ciscos out there anymore because of all the overfishing and the habitat loss. Alewife slid right in there and said, wow, this place rocks. Many of you know alewife, I'm guessing, 6 to 8 inches. Eats zooplankton, eats some larval fish. And they did so well, they almost kind of ate themselves out of the lake. And they were prone to having, like, in the spring, coming out of winter, they're really hungry, maybe didn't get enough to eat, and they had prone to these die-offs. We had a die-off a couple of years ago. It's kind of surprising. And so here's some iconic images again, littering the beaches. This is actually, again, one of our research vessels. They pulled the net up and just couldn't keep them all in the net, just spilled over. So many alewife out there. Chicago Harbor, Time Magazine, July 7th, 1967. The big die-off was in 67. And, you know, maybe you can get an idea from the culture of the 60s there by the cover, but talked about ribbons of dead fish 50 feet by 40 miles in the lake. So these alewife are not helping whatever of those few cisco, small C ciscos remained in the lake. All right. So that's kind of the hard declining stuff. So let's talk about some of the more positive things and why these opportunities might be at our doorstep. So the first good thing I'll highlight is the formation of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission in 1954. And it was really the sea lamprey crisis that spurred all of these jurisdictions. Let's just take Lake Michigan with the tribes, with Indiana, with Illinois, with Michigan, Wisconsin. They were all sort of managing that on their own. And it was the sea lamprey crisis that got all of these jurisdictions to come together and work in a more consensus base. As I say here, interjurisdictional cooperation for fisheries management. In 1960s, we started stocking lake trout, coho salmon, Chinook salmon, because of that massive amount of alewife that was there. You know, they described it as if, you know, it wasn't necessarily to create a fishery, but really it was to create a fishery, of course, but to take advantage of all that prey that existed. You know, brilliant idea, and many of these species took off and did really well because of the alewife that was there to support them. In 1970, founded the EPA to begin to sort of regulate water quality and air quality. Birds came back, for example. We didn't have the Silent Springs. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in 1972. This was a pact between Canada and the United States to try to get on top of that point source pollution of nutrients and contaminants. And by 1973, we had the Endangered Species Act. This, of course, was too late for those ciscos that I described earlier. And we had the Endangered Species Act in 1933. We might still have, I don't know for sure, but we'd have a better chance of all those native species still swimming around supporting fisheries in Lake Michigan. But it hasn't really been, because of when it came to be and because when we lost those ciscos, it really wasn't relevant, but it's still an evidence of the environmental awakening. So what did that lead to in terms of changes in the lake? We've seen, because of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and also because of these mussels that are doing a great job of filtering out all the phytoplankton, we've seen a more than 60% reduction in total phosphorus in Lake Michigan, measured out in the middle of the lake by EPA. So cleaning up the water in terms of clarity, but that also means less phytoplankton, means less zooplankton, it means less fish because they don't have as much food to eat. The lake itself has become twice as clear in 20 years. We do this with a Secchi disc. And so it's just like you see here, you're lowering it down until you can't see it anymore. It's a pretty simple thing to get a measure of clarity. And so if you look at what the water clarity was in the 80s through 2000s, it was pretty stable, about 10 meters. So still like 30 feet down, you could see that Secchi disc depth. But then once those mussels came in, now you can see that Secchi disc all the way down to 20 meters, 24 meters sometimes. I think 24 meters is my record. And I don't have that great of an eyesight, which probably affects it a little bit. So this is a good time to plug. What is it? Next week on the 30th, this documentary series, All Too Clear, talks about sort of how this came to be and what its effects might be on fish. Alewife. So alewife, of course, are really important now to the salmon fishery. And these are data that go back to 1962. And so this is capturing in the 60s how much alewife was out there by our tows that you saw some of them were spilling out on the deck. So over 400 kilotons of fish dropped precipitously until about the early 1980s. And that was because of salmon, a trout, like just there was now something eating those alewife. Really a great success story in supporting and creating a fishery, as well as lake trout, also eating lake alewife. And then we saw sort of stability from like 1982 to like early 2000s. Some years, 1998, really warm, produced a lot of alewife. 2005, 2002 rather, produced a lot of alewife. But in the last 15 or so years, we are not picking them up in our bottom trawl like we used to. That part of that could be a catchability issue because the water's so clear. But I think it's also indicative of just fewer alewife in the lake, in part because there's, again, less food for alewife to eat. Smelt, another story. So this is the other 9 native species I didn't spend much time talking about. Came in even much earlier than alewife. When alewife started going down in the 70s, smelt bounced up, took advantage of that. But since the 1980s, smelt have been on like a one-way trip down. And this is the assessments in our gear. Again, not the perfect, but we think it's quite good at sort of picking up the trends. I think similar people that would go smelt fishing in the rivers in April would tell you the same thing. Like it's not as good as it used to be. And so if we think about like the primary prey fish in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was bloater, alewife, and smelt, right? We lost all those other 7 or 8 different species that we had. But all the while, the good news is that we really, or not we, but the managers have been able to maintain a pretty diverse fishery. It's been dominated by Chinook salmon there in the bottom, the green. The proportion of lake trout has also been increasing in light blue in recent years. And then, of course, coho and brown trout and rainbow trout help sort of round out a diverse fishery with a lot of economic importance. So where does that leave us then in terms of native fish restoration? Why are we now talking about going back to the future and trying to see, can we bring some of these other species that we used to have back into the lake? Can we go back to the future, right? So one of the reasons we think this might be possible is that these deep and shallow water ciscos that I talked about earlier, they thrived in a low productivity environment. That's how they evolved. Like, you know, before we came in and started putting nutrients in and destroying the habitat and that sort of thing, like this was their thing. So we are moving in a direction of low productivity again up in the water column. They might be really successful or more successful than alewife and smelt might be able to be sort of long-term. The fishery managers have a primary fisheries management objective to maintain a diversity of prey species matched to primary production, so matched to how much nutrients and algae is out there, and to predator demands. So that diversity is a key part. So just like when you hopefully invest for retirement, you don't put everything in like one stock, right? You don't put everything in Enron and then have Enron collapse and then you're lost. Like you diversify. The same thing from like a fish community perspective. If you have a diversity of prey fishes out there, maybe some years one doesn't do as well, another one can sort of compensate. That gives you the best sort of potential to be stable and resilient through time to support the salmon and the trout at the top. And again, just kind of what I said, thinking about just creating a more resilient ecosystem that not only can sort of provide more stability across time, but some of these species move into the near shore different times of the year. They live on the bottom during the day. They move up in the water column at night. We call that sort of connectivity from like an ecology point of view, moving energy up and down the food web. That can also be more resistant to more invasive species coming in because you're sort of occupying multiple niches the way it used to be. So the way that we are talking about doing this is an adaptive management approach. So adaptive, again, I don't expect you to be able to see all of what's described here, but just look at the arrow. Or actually, let me point you to the top. So the Council of Lake Committees, those are the fishery managers. They're the ones that sort of say, we would like to, let's say, restore Cisco in Lake Erie. And so they set the priorities. And then what you have then, once you sort of get the priorities from the managers, the science role that I play is that orange planning part. So we go in and we say, okay, if you want Cisco back in Lake Erie, how can we maximize the probability that that's going to be successful? And how are we going to do that? So we might, for example, look at where Cisco in Lake Erie used to live. And so the third box here is called, or the last box is a threats assessment. So we look and we say, well, why did Cisco and Lake Erie go away in the first place? And is that threat still exist today as an impediment? We might run some models with different scenarios, like what if we stock this many fish, or what if we improve this kind of habitat? And those models will help us, again, sort of game the system and maximize our probability that when we do it, we're going to our return on investment will be high, and we're going to have a greater probability of those Cisco coming back to Lake Erie. So that's the planning part. And then the managers would implement whatever plan is recommended with the managers, of course. This is not, this isn't scientists developing a plan and giving it to the managers. The managers are at the table working with the scientists, developing the plan, we implementing it. And then the key part of adaptive management is that you don't just say, okay, hope it works. You evaluate, you go in and you see, is this working? Are they surviving? Are they reproducing? And if not, you adjust. You think, okay, we got something wrong in our sort of understanding of how this is working. And so adaptive management is used throughout all of resource management. This is not something new. We have just tailored this to apply to coragonines, ciscos, and whitefishes, wherever the managers want to do this. And there's interest in doing this across the basin. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that as we end here. So the first example, make that go smaller. Okay. So the first place this happened was Lake Ontario. So Lake Ontario had three species of ciscos, but they had only one species left, like the lake herring, Coragonus arteti. They lost the deep water forms, and they wanted to have deep water ciscos back in the lake. So there was planning that occurred to figure out, well, where's the best place to get a deep water cisco from? And they decided, and again, Mark Holy was a part of this, Lake Michigan is actually, there's some bloater in Lake Michigan. Why don't we go to Lake Michigan? Do the hard work of collecting the eggs and the milt in the January and February, rear them in hatcheries from Canada to New York to Michigan, and stock them in Lake Ontario. And that's what we've been doing for the past 10 years. The numbers are not real. I mean, 1.3 million fish about that size. It may not sound like a lot, but to figure out how to create these deep water species and get the right water temperature, that was hard work. And we can only get, a certain number of eggs every year. And, there's high mortality of those. How is this going so far? It's hard to say. 15 recaptures through the evaluation part of that. Here's an example of one of the recaptures here in the top. Probably had been living out in Lake Ontario at least 3 years. Isn't a ton, but it's a big lake. We're not sampling all of it all the time. So people have done some back of the envelope calculations that there may be as many as 10,000 bloaters swimming out there in Lake Ontario. Unfortunately, we have not found evidence of baby bloater yet. So no larval bloater yet. So that would be the sort of the next milestone to hit. That there's enough bloater out there that they're finding each other, reproducing, and then we maybe don't have to rely on stocking as much. So this is, again, in its early stages. You might say 10 years, gosh, Bo, that's not too early, but it took us 50 years for lake trout in some lakes. And we're not even all the way there yet. And that's with a top predator. They can grow fast. These are smaller bait fishes. May be tougher for them to survive to reach the point of lake maturity. Here's one that's looking a little bit more promising, I think. This is in Saginaw Bay. So how I showed you in Lake Michigan, the lake herring or the capital C Cisco, the heart of that was in Green Bay and then Grand Traverse Bay. Well, in Lake Huron, the heartbeat of Cisco was in Saginaw Bay. And today, and for the past 30 years, there have been no Cisco in Saginaw Bay. And so the Lake Huron fishery managers started a program in 2018 to begin reintroducing Cisco into Saginaw Bay. This is done by Fish and Wildlife Service, collecting gametes up in the Les Cheneaux Islands region. Those Cisco are reared not that long in the hatchery. They go in at about this size or at about this size, so even smaller than what the bloater go in Lake Ontario, and younger. And some of those fish are coming back. And 2 years ago, we got these beautiful big fish coming back into Saginaw Bay. We've had about 60 recaptures to date. But again, we haven't yet hit that milestone of natural reproduction yet. We think that's coming very soon. We might even have it in our genetics bank yet, because we can't tell when they're really little, what's a whitefish, what's a Cisco. But this is looking to be sort of promising. Lake Erie, they have decided to do an experimental Cisco reintroduction. Ciscos were gone in Lake Erie by the 1950s. And the Lake Erie Committee agreed to try doing this starting first in the New York water, so way over in the Eastern Basin where it's deep, cold water. We started doing that restoration planning, the modeling and the threats assessment to kind of see what areas might be best. But this year, about 200,000, 300,000 Cisco reared in out of Jordan. Actually reared in 3 different hatcheries between Michigan and Pennsylvania. Will go in this year. So we're really excited to see how that goes. And this is just an example of some of the habitat models we can build, showing you where the hot spots for Cisco spawning could be, to sort of inform some of these stocking locations into the future if it were to expand outside of New York waters. All right, Lake Michigan. So where does Lake Michigan fit in all of this? Lake Michigan was the one, of course, that had the biggest diversity, or one of the largest diversities. Well, just this past October, we got the request from the Lake Michigan fishery managers to do those orange planning steps to just see about the feasibility of this. Give them some information first to do an experimental Cisco reintroduction down in Illinois. So Illinois is keen on sort of seeing if they could get Cisco back in their waters of Lake Michigan. And then second one is Kai. So that's a species that still is doing really well in Lake Superior. If we could figure out how to rear them, collect their eggs. Then you can think of more abundant and widespread cisco, potentially supporting more of the pelagic-oriented salmon. So they are potentially more like what alewife could be, especially at smaller cisco sizes. And then as well as lake trout. And those kai are going to be deeper, more overlapping with the lake trout. And here's just some images of, so that's a bloater on the top from Lake Superior, much like our bloater in Lake Michigan. And then there's kai, which is smaller, has the bigger eye, longer fins, which you can't really see there. But this would, if we're going to have bloater back in Lake Michigan, it would look like this sorry, if we're going to have kai back in Lake Michigan, it would look like this one from Lake Superior. So what is the Lake Superior role in this? This is the one lake I haven't talked about. Well, it's really it still is the source. If we wanted to go back and bring some of this diversity back, that's where it still exists. And it's also a place where we can begin to understand where a more intact community is in place. How do they interact with each other? How do they interact with their habitat? And so this is so we've done some preliminary work trying to get kai to see if we can just raise them in hatcheries. And kai spawn again in January, February. And that's one thing doing it around in southern Lake Michigan, but it's a whole nother thing doing it in Lake Superior. A lot more ice to fight through. This is a tribal boat breaking through the ice off of Munising, Grand Island, where some deep gill nets were set. And these are some tribal biologists, Chris Day and Jason Smith, trying to figure out, okay, which of these are cisco and which are bloater, make the crosses, and we'll try to rear them in the hatchery. And we do have some kai bloater crosses still alive, but we haven't been able to do a kai times kai cross yet. Still working on it. To be realistic, though, there are still challenges to doing this. It's not the same lake as it was in the 1930s, right? We've got these mussels. And the mussels, of course, here's the sort of the quagga mussels, the ones that go deep, covering the bottom of the lake now. They are very highly associated with the decline in diparia. So diparia, this is the sort of the trajectory. Used to have diparia all over the lake, 94, 95. All of these deep water ciscos would eat diparia. They would eat mysis. They would eat deep water, like zooplankton, some of the calanoid copepods. Well, we've kind of lost that diparia part of their diet. And we don't know what impact that will have on whether or not they're able to be really successful. And there's still diparia in Lake Superior because they don't have the mussels in Lake Superior. So, you know, that's a sort of a wide-eyed realization of this doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work. This is one of the challenges. So do they have enough food? And the other thing that we're thinking more and more about mussels is how they're affecting the spawning habitat of these fishes. They're filling, you know, I talked in the beginning about the sediments filling in the cracks and the crevices among all of the gravel and the cobble. Well, now you've got those mussels kind of filling them in. They're creating their own cracks and crevices. But to the extent that they're healthy for like egg incubation, I think is still a research question that we don't know the answer to. Climate change. And so another thing about, especially the shallow water species like capital C cisco and whitefish, they're spawning in shallower waters that historically would have benefited from ice cover. And so I don't know if you can see the figure here. So these would be like little eggs among the rocks here where whitefish or cisco would spawn. And then the ice cover would protect those eggs from high wind, high suspension energy events. But now with less ice cover, those eggs are more likely to be disturbed, become potentially available to predators. So this is also probably not helpful, especially for the shallow water species. For the deep water ciscos, whether there's ice out in the middle of the lake when they're, 300 feet down, their eggs are, it's affecting the thermal habitat, but probably not a physical protection issue. All right, so in conclusion, I sort of talked about we've lost a lot of the diversity in the Cisco community. Most of it was gone by the 1950s. However, with improving fisheries management, cooperation that led to things like the control of sea lamprey, with improvement of water quality and reduction in sort of the pollution, lower nutrients has led to Great Lakes that are not as hospitable to alewife and smelt. There just aren't enough nutrients. There isn't enough productivity out there for these fish that do best in higher productivity environments. So now it's more like a lake where some of those low productivity fish, like the Ciscos, can potentially have a better chance. And so the fishery managers have endorsed this science-based adaptive management framework to see whether or not it's worth investing in restoring Cisco or potentially whitefish diversity. We've only used this adaptive management wheel for whitefish in Lake Ontario, where whitefish are they're a species of concern in New York waters. Like whitefish are really rare in Lake Ontario. We're in the early days of this. Like we're like a decade in Lake Ontario, and we're just beginning the planning steps in Lake Michigan that may lead nowhere. So these are early days, but I'm an optimistic person. I'm wide-eyed to the challenges and hopeful that we can learn from other lakes, from other restoration efforts like lake trout that we've done. We do have the support of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to do some of this planning, to do the implementation in some of these lakes. So I'm hopeful that this could be a very positive story decade or 2 decades from now. If you want to learn anything more about this, we have a website, greatlakesciscos.org. It talks all about sort of what the status is of Ciscos in all the lakes. We have a monthly webinar series where you can learn more about, what's going on in the hatcheries, what's going on in the science. You can, those are, of course, I host those, so I would highly recommend them. But go check out our website if you're interested in learning more. And I think, Mark, you're going to talk about, you want to do questions first? Okay. So thanks, everybody.
We get robbed. Any questions? First lights on.
I can probably hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering what your opinion was of the abundance of the cormorants and their impact on the fisheries.
You're asking that again. So.
Yeah.
I was wondering about the abundance of the cormorants and what your opinion is on their impact on the fisheries.
Yeah, I don't know that much about cormorants, honestly. I mean, I'm aware of the effect they're having in the near shore, but it's not something I study really carefully. I've read some papers talking about localized, really heavy impacts, but it's really outside. I'm not really an expert to really give you an educated opinion on that. Sorry. Yes.
Observation. I live along Lake Michigan. This year, the alewives population, the die-off, is much bigger. It was
Really?
3 to 4 times what we've had in the last 4 to 5 years. Don't ask me why. And as a result, the white pelicans hung around for a good 2 months. We had white pelicans just in the water because the alewives were incredibly easy picking.
Yeah.
Just an observation, just to let you know, that it was a big this year.
Yeah, I didn't hear about that as much on the Michigan side. So I wonder if that was
It was just
interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Lake Michigan side, not on the Bay side. I don't know about the Bay side, but the Lake
Right.
Michigan side.
Okay. Yeah.
Was wondering how all this affects the walleye, the bass, the perch, and what most
Closer to shore. Right.
mean, you didn't mention it at all. I wonder if any of this is bait fish for them or what?
I don't know the answer to that. Most of these deep water cisco, most of that diversity is in the deeper waters, like much deeper. So I don't think they would have interacted much. Ciscos can probably overlap more with some of those species. The ciscos we have in Lake Michigan today are growing super fast, and they're eating like some alewife and some round gobies, and they're doing things that ciscos did not used to do in the past. So they aren't, weeks to months old cisco might feed some walleye or pike or some other nearshore predators, but pretty quickly, I think some of those ciscos, even that are more shallow water, are going to outgrow the gapes of some of those more nearshore species. So I haven't really thought about that as much, but I think they tend to maybe use different habitats for the most part. Yeah. So most of the lake, yeah, certainly most people interact with the lake very close to shore and take their boat out not that far, but most of the lake is, of course, deep, cold water, where now we have the ability with charter boats and others to go out and sort of exploit that for salmon and trout. But that's more the waters, the deeper offshore waters that I sort of focused on today. But that's a good question. Yeah.
You can raise your hand. Well, I don't know if I got a question, but I pretty much got a comment.
Just talking the bayside, I think we've seen some walleye populations that are kind of shifting around,
Yeah.
but because of the population of whitefish
Yeah.
and the alewife that we've never seen in the bay like we have them now, we still have some smelt left, which all of them fish, I would believe, and you probably would know better than me, get into the size where a walleye is going to eat them. And we're not only finding the less walleyes than what we had, but an awful big population of forage. So let's make Green Bay a little bit different to fish than it was even 4 or 5 years ago.
You've seen those changes in fewer walleye, more bait fish.
Mhm.
Huh. Wonder why walleye aren't doing better with all the bait fish then.
Well, either that or they've got so much food that they don't have to take a bait anymore.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. Yeah.
Got a question.
Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know.
Here.
Yeah, I spent a lot of my life growing up on Long Island Sound
Okay.
and in Connecticut, and no-wats were a real issue there, especially because of the tidal waters. Where do the eelwives come from that are in our Great Lakes? Do you know?
Say the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, the same ones that you grew up. In fact, they're like threatened. Like people are trying to conserve alewife now on the Atlantic Ocean into those tributaries. So yeah, they're not doing well there. So it's the same group, and genetically, I don't know. So when we've looked at alewife genetics across the lakes, don't see any differences because they've been here, I don't know, 12, 15, 20 generations, but I don't know if they've compared them back to the originating stock from the St. Lawrence Seaway where they came, but I would guess they'd be pretty similar.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I just have another questions. I don't know the answer on this. Why does Lake Superior not have any zebras and quags? Is it temperature?
No, it's calcium.
Sure.
So, I'm from the US Geological Survey, and this is the only time I can talk about geology. Because otherwise I don't know why I shouldn't say anything. But anyway, the geology of most of like where the water comes in Lake Superior doesn't have much calcium. And so it's just under the threshold. And actually you go to North Channel of Lake Huron, which is very similar sort of like from a geological perspective. They will get the baby veligers, like the planktonic mussels, but when they're up in the plankton, that's when they take on calcium and build their shell And once their shells get big enough, they settle out on the bottom, and then they grow more and more shell, filter out more and more plankton. There's just not enough calcium for those to live. So we want to make sure we keep nobody add calcium to Lake Superior. Yes, sir, I can hear you.
I'm wondering if you could review the funding sources for this kind of research, what agencies fund this, and what the funding prognosis is for the near term and long term for continuing this sort of work.
Yeah, I think two major ones I would mention, the GLRI, and I think well, I can't comment on funding sources as a federal employee. So, but I would just make it as an observation as a citizen that
GLRI is a godsend. You have to keep that going. It's pumped upwards to $400 million a year into the Great Lakes for a wide variety of stuff, but including a lot of fisheries work. I know when I was working, by the time GLRI was done, it provided 75% of our budget at Green Bay. So I think that's what he was trying to allude to, but I can say it, he really can.
I was going to make the observation that it started in the Bush administration, continued in the Obama. Well, the idea of it started in the Bush administration, continued in Obama, continued in Trump, under Biden. It's a bipartisan. I think GLRI, as long as you know, it's viewed positively across the basin, maybe that's a good sign. The other source is the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. So they pay my salary, for example, and some other scientists' salaries. So they are, again, as that interjurisdictional group that looks for ways to, and native fish restoration is part of their goal. You know, that's another really important source for some of this work. Yeah.
Here's the three big fish that you basically talk about is the goby, and the ciscos, and the owens. So if a fish eats one of each, which one carries the most energy that it transfers to the predator fish?
Oh, wow. So energy is like a function of so the density of the energy density of the fish. So like when you eat a candy bar, how many calories is in that candy bar? Right. And so when you look at like the energy density of the fish, they all have different levels of like calories per gram. And so like from a calorie perspective, a bloater is the best. It's the fattiest. So, but then you got to take into account the weight of the fish. Like how big is it? So it's like the weight times the calories gives you the total energy sort of bang for the buck. So like, you know, a small bloater might give you more energy than a larger alewife, for example. So that's the way that you would figure that out. Sometimes it's not just about like the calories or the energy. Sometimes it's also about sort of the essential fatty acids or, you know, amino acids. And that's where, again, like some of these native species have an advantage. They tend to be higher because of their lipids and their amino acids to be more rich and provide a more rich diet. Just the same way that dipariah prey, the one we lost, that like that's a really high energy plus like lipid rich nutrient source for fishes. And now instead we have mussels, which most of those calories are like in the shell, and the soft tissue has some value, but we've got to, those fish have to, the fish that can even eat the mussels have to deal with the shell part of it too. So there are some like issues in terms of how energy is transferred and the quality of those prey that are relevant to kind of how all this pieces together. The last thing I'll say is that alewife have thiaminase. So it's an enzyme in their fillets that breaks down thiamine, which I think is vitamin B1. Yeah, and so if you are a predator and you eat a lot of alewife, which a lot of the fish do, you could end up producing eggs that have low levels of thiamine, and they might be deformed or they might not hatch very well. So that's another reason that fishery managers are interested in getting the predators to have a more diverse diet than just alewife. Some alewife is probably fine, but if you're alewife all the time, you're gonna have the calories there, but you may have some not just deficiencies, but actual have those enzymes that are working against you to like maintain vitamin levels. So yeah, it's a whole nutrition is a really interesting topic, and there's a lot you can unpack with that good question that you asked. Yeah. Scott.
So. From a migratory standpoint, so lake whitefish become more migratory over the last 2 or 3 decades. With Cisco's, the shallow water forms in particular, what can you tell us about? Have they evolved? Have they changed their migratory habits with all these changes to the food web? Do we know? I don't know how much acoustic tagging or where it's been done across the Great Lakes, but, and I ask this in light of like, if you start a colonization, if you start a restoration in some part of the lake, what are the chances they're going to radiate and recolonize other areas? We're pretty sure they're not coming across from Grand Traverse over here. We're just not seeing that as an example, but is there evidence otherwise that this is happening?
Yeah, really good question. So for Cisco, we do have a few telemetry studies. That Grand Traverse stock with Daryl Hondorp was able to stock and show some movements out of Grand Traverse Bay, foraging into deeper waters than we thought, kind of like they do in Lake Superior, then coming back to spawn in Grand Traverse Bay. Similar things in Lake Huron. They put tags in those Lake Chanot Island stock where we're getting those fish to stock into Saginaw Bay. We're seeing some movement out of that region, and then again tight, but they're not doing the big sort of immigration or like far distance. Like nobody's colonized Green Bay yet, right? So in terms of rivers, Andrew Hansi has a new paper out showing that Cisco are spawning up in the north. There's a river in the North Channel called the Spanish River, and he's found them all the way up to the farthest dam, like 35 kilometers up in the Spanish River. And then he's got tags in those fish, and I'm not going to tell you the answer. Like he's told me kind of the unpublished data, but they're moving. They're not staying in those rivers all the time. So like the whitefish in Green Bay that started moving up into so many of these rivers, Cisco definitely have that in there. They used to do that all the time. We have a lot of documentation from many rivers across all the lakes, and we are still seeing that today, very recently, by some of Andrew Hansi's work up in the North Channel. Now we're waiting, or he's waiting to get the genetics back to see if those are different than the Cisco and other parts of North Channel or the Lake Chanot Islands, but they do appear to have that ability to try to move and colonize new areas in Lake Huron that we haven't really seen yet happen in Lake Michigan. So, yeah.
Other questions?
Sure.
Why don't you hold this? That was working. Okay. They're not gonna squeak.
You didn't mention anything about what I know that they've been worried about as well. Anything on the Asian carp impacting any of this stuff?
No, it's not a bad question. It's a good question because we hear a lot about the silver and big head carp. And certainly, you know, I teach a fisheries science class, and when I started teaching that class in 2010 and 12 and 14, like all the students wanted to know about that. Like that, we heard a lot about that. And I teach it every 2 years. So I went back and sort of looked at, okay, where are we? Because I don't hear much about it as much in the media. And it turns out they're really kind of at the same place in terms of the front in the Illinois River as they were really 10 years ago. They really, so things are good there. And we have like through some, I think the bipartisan infrastructure law. There was funding that's going to help us build a second barrier below the existing barrier. Now that's, not fully funded, and I don't know if it'll be in place in time. I think the odds are at some point that one or both of those species will invade. The question is there enough food for them to really thrive? And some recent models have shown that, when we did those models in 2010, the answer was no. Like, mussels got there first, right? And the mussels filtered out all the plankton, and there's not much for those silver and bighead to eat. But some more recent modeling has suggested, well, depending on what they eat, and will they eat these little rotifers, and will they go down and eat clitoff, things we don't really know until they invade. It's possible that, God forbid, if they were to get in Green Bay, that's horrible, right? But to get to Green Bay, there's a lot of really like desert for them to move through. And that's sort of the hope, is that we'll be able to keep them from the barrier and this additional barrier. And they don't appear to have moved if we've been able to keep them at bay. And then if they do get through, then they got to go through the desert to get to the sort of the oasis. And we just got to hope that desert, they don't make it through. That makes sense.
There's enough biomass in Green Bay to support
Yeah, I don't need that, trust me.
The people on the Zoom can't hear you.
Oh, on the Zoom, okay. You're saying there's more biomass in Green Bay than in the rest of the lake?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot more plankton. They would be a lot for them to eat in Green Bay.
Okay.
They'd be very, yeah. What she said.
Unless the hearing is established.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, Rob. Yeah.
So are there any questions from Zoom? If you unmute yourself and try asking a question, I think we'll be able to hear you. Charlie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, can you hear me? I don't know if I'm muted or not.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, excellent presentation, Bo. And as I'm sitting here being silent, which I'm always not good at, I realized I lived your entire presentation. I raked alewives up on the beaches of Chicago when I was in high school and college, just so kids could go swimming. So and I fished chubs, which disappeared. We've chased whitefish as they've evolved, but the question I have now that I think you might be able to answer is, you referenced it when you said Cisco might be better because they would not create the same thiamine problem. But we've talked about restoring native lake trout forever, and now we're getting natural reproduction of lake trout, which is suspected because they're eating less alewife. So, we're managing the lake for an abundance of alewife, but to feed the salmon, but it's inhibiting natural reproduction in the lake trout. And it's a conundrum that, the managers are trying to wade their way through, but it's just something I thought we should comment on.
Yeah, that's a perfect observation. And fortunately, I'm not a manager, so I don't have to deal with that conundrum. And my role as a federal employee keeps me from commenting on that conundrum. So I get to kind of just say, yeah, that's a very nice comment.
Yeah, well, my axe to grind about it is that we've removed a lot of control on the sport fishery, where bag limits and seasons and stuff, and we also have tribal fisheries fishing lake trout, and our Wisconsin commercial fishery can't even get a few thousand lake trout, which just seems like a great injustice. When by emergency rule 7 years ago, the DNR declared that there were too many lake trout in the lake eating alewife that the salmon needed. So we'd love to help with that. We're working very hard.
Well, now we're switching topics.
Yeah. Well, we're not. We're talking prey fish at the base of it. So
Right.
excellent presentation. Thanks, Bo, and thanks, Mark. Yeah.
Are
Thank
there anybody else on Zoom that would like to unmute and ask a question? You can do that now.
Patsy, Bunnel, you don't have a question. My mom joined.
Okay, one more round of applause for Bo. Well, if you've been coming to these fish tales the last couple of years, we have had kind of a focus on Green Bay a lot more with suckers and some of the movement of walleyes and whitefish and the smallmouth bass work. So we are switching a little bit more to the lake this year. The next one up is the All Too Clear, which is a documentary on the impact of mussels, primarily quaggas, on the Great Lakes. It's pretty spectacular. I know all the free tickets have been sold, or at least have been taken, because we don't want to overrun our capacity here. You can get on by Zoom as well. The normal way, you get on the Door County Library event calendar and go to the date, and they'll have a Zoom link. You can watch it that way. And I know there's issues about the video quality over Zoom and so on. Well, I talked to the producer this morning, and she's actually going to share a regular Vimeo link that those people watching on Zoom can watch it directly instead of through Zoom. They can just dial in on the internet directly. So you will have as good a quality as you'll see here. So don't be shy to get on Zoom next week. Exactly how we're going to do that, I don't know yet, but she says she can explain it. So Bo touched on it. We talked about it a bit today, how important mussels are to the ecology of the lake these days. So our next talk then after All Too Zoom is going to be Scott Hansen providing this update on whitefish, because their habits have changed because of these ecosystem changes, and we'll learn the details of that. And then, like I say, the tribal one won't actually touch on anything in Lake Michigan, but the last one will then talk about the secrets we're learning through the coded wire tagging program. So just to tease you a little bit, I'm going to see. Wait a minute. Get out of this. Stop sharing. That's how I do it. Okay. Now I got to share. How am I going to do this? Well, maybe the people on Zoom won't see it, so you're going to have to zoom in next week. But here is their trailer for what you're going to see next week.
Beneath the surface of the Great Lakes of North America, there's been an invasion of unprecedented scale.
There's quadrillions of quagga mussels in the Great Lakes. In a week's time, every gallon of water in Lake Michigan could have passed through a mussel.
Those mussels created a system that is really now much different than what we had seen before.
The number of fishers is at an all-time low. The number of fish harvested is at an all-time low. But this tragic invasion has an unexpected silver lining.
Obviously, quagga mussels have done a lot of damage, but it's ironic because it is an opportunity to restore the Great Lakes.
Join a remarkable journey into the heart of the Great Lakes and experience the wonder of the world's largest freshwater ecosystem like you've never seen it before.
It's just incredible, the clarity of the lake.
We're going to have to think far outside of the norm if we're going to save this relationship between the people and the fish.
You don't want to miss it. Thank you very much.